Hi, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. I'm Dr. Matt DiCarlo. This is Dr. Monica Eaton. We are here to present Technological Engagement as Transgression, Social Work, and Digital Citizenship. So my name, as I said, is Dr. Matt DiCarlo. I'm an assistant professor of social work at Stockton University. I also run a project called Open Social Work that's dedicated to spreading open access, open education, and open science in social work.
Awesome. So good to see you again today, Matt. My name is Monica Eaton. I am from Michigan State University School of Social Work, and I have two roles. One, I'm Associate Director of Teaching and Instruction, and I'm also Director of the undergraduate program, where most of my work has really focused on social media and how we incorporate that into teaching and learning. So I'm excited to just engage in a conversation with you, Matt, about how the ways we're approaching tech use in social work ed is impacting our work and our work with students. So to start off, how would you define open pedagogy or open educational practices?
Awesome, thanks. So there are two real ways to think about it. So open education, open pedagogy are really part of broader movements like open access and open science and open source software that are trying to increase access to and engagement with scholarly information and just information more broadly. But like within open pedagogy, there is, I think, one current that's more around OER-enabled pedagogy. So OER being resources that are either in the public domain or that are free to use. And free to reuse and mix together and do all sorts of cool stuff with. And this vein of open pedagogy is really about sort of like using and co-creating and sharing those open educational resources in class. So you might like redesign your class to use an open textbook. You might end up like, contributing to Wikipedia, contributing to open textbook projects. And it also has to do with sort of being more student-centered and flexible in course design. So like one of the examples is there was like no project management textbook for instructional designers. So they took a project management textbook in another discipline. And then the course was adapting that textbook for the discipline that the students were studying. So you could do some co-creation with students. Open educational practices, a little bit more broadly, have also a sort of social justice bent. They really have to do with some of the barriers to learning that aren't just like paywalls. So if you're looking at some of the things from the real college movement, food insecurity, homelessness, financial barriers to learning. So you'll find a lot of people who are engaged in open educational practices doing things like having basic need statements inside of their syllabi, running supply pantries informally. So it's a way of sort of thinking about access to higher education and access to information from a social justice perspective and contributing to the knowledge commons. Also, another strain in there is around student rights. There's a big movement, especially with the switch to online, around anti-surveillance and proctoring and Proctorio and all the wonderful things that they've been doing and sort of fighting against some of that stuff.
I think you bring up some interesting concepts too of how this ties into social justice and I think student success and supporting students where they're at and how this is really just so much more broad reaching than thinking about like a quick access to information, right? That there's these really important systems implications that come along with it. So if a faculty member like adopts these kinds of practices, like how could you see their preparation or their course maybe being different?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick on what you were saying, I think the tagline that I was given was, come for the cost, stay for the pedagogy. Mm-hmm. So you end up getting a lot of these like cost savings and that feels really good. And you're maybe a little bit more free with the textbook that you're using, but you end up sort of getting into a lot of these deeper concepts. And so, there are a couple of different ways that open education sort of impacts your course prep. So for the graduate research methods course that I teach, I have collaborated with a number of other faculty members, either as reviewers or advisors or co-authors on the textbook that we use. It is a group prep. We've tried to make it as applicable as possible across different schools. And that was something that took a couple of years. It took some grant funding. But sort of the goal was to create these widely shareable resources that lived on open platforms that other faculty members at other institutions could use and that students could contribute as part of those classes. So like we have an appendix of like student creative resources, which is kind of cool. So yeah, that it might also involve like collaborating with students on resources. And as part of that process, as a faculty member, you're taking on some new roles. It's a little bit different than like, well, I'm going to just customize the slideshows that come from the publisher and things like that. It's more about like you're taking on the role of a textbook publisher and as a marketer and visual designer. And there are lots of technologies that make that easier, but it still takes time to do all that stuff. And it also is a resource, just like an open source software project, that sort of continues throughout time. So you sort of need to think about the sustainability of that project, how much resources you need to do it, what the commitment is over the summer to sort of keep up those resources. It was weird, I didn't teach research methods this year, so I ended up doing a lot of people's prep work over the summer and revising the textbook and like putting out some of the edits that they requested.
Awesome. So do you have any more examples of sort of this more social justice oriented approach to open education?
Yeah, so the social justice oriented approach, I think, when I teach like advocacy classes, I try to do an advocacy project with students. So I think a lot of the more social justice oriented approaches are really consonant with the public impact scholarship that social work professors do all the time. Like your policy class probably has a go write an op-ed or go lobby these, like you're trying to make some kind of public impact, and it's sort of that same thing. So I work with students sort of as key informants on topics that they find really impactful to their practice right now. So previously that was issues around school-based mental health services, basically in the state that I used to live in. They just don't really exist very much anymore. They decided to cut those by 2/3, which is, kind of bad. And students were really concerned about that because they were losing jobs and placements. So we did a project on that. This year, they sort of talked about being unpaid frontline workers during COVID and the impacts on equity for unpaid internships. So we're working on putting in public comments and building a social media campaign to change the 2022 EPOS to allow for field placements, basically using the same language that they did during COVID. So there's some great articles that I think are sort of worth thinking about when you're thinking about open educational resources, whether you are thinking about things in a more content-centric way versus a process-centric way. So is it more about communicating given information or about engaging in a process of learning? And so, in this advocacy project, it is sort of both. I'm teaching them how to like do the do the advocacy projects, but also teaching them that like they should be engaging with clients and engaging with people with lower power to advocate on their behalf and to advocate with them. It is more teacher-centric though, because they are sort of, playing me as a ventriloquist dummy. So they sort of design the things, but I'm also sort of a part of that process as well. And they are applying that in their own advocacy projects within their own groups. So yeah, it's focused on economic justice, cultural injustice, political injustice, and sort of the exclusion of specifically non-traditional students from how we plan for field and sort of how the financial situation of social work students is supposed to shake out in higher ed. So yeah, it's a way, so that is an open education project that's sort of a little bit different than projects that are around like, creating open textbooks, or like I've done projects with students rather than doing like quizzes each semester. I would have them create quiz questions or case studies or things like that they would then share out publicly. And all that stuff is great. All that stuff is open education, but these more like critical projects, I think, are probably a little bit more at home in social work, and also, they're fun to do.
Definitely. What are some tensions that arise when faculty engage in open educational practices?
So I think there are quite a bit of them. There's sort of like a skepticism and lack of knowledge about open education and open access. And there's really a lack of top-down support for that stuff. There are mandates on the state level for institutions to come up with open educational policies, but when you're getting down to the guidelines for tenure and promotion, what like national social work bodies are talking about, there's not really a lot of buy-in for and a lot of incentives for faculty to do that work. And, as somebody who's published an open textbook, the definition of book publishing inside of my tenure and promotion guidelines is, are you with a commercial publisher? And commercial publishers don't tend to like books that are available for free. So it sort of eliminates, and that was like 2 years of my life that like, that's something that will not count as a publication, even though it took a tremendous amount of work to do. And there's also a lot of complications in that too, because like half that book is copied and pasted. So how do you measure original scholarship? It's a lot more sort of like intensive from a committee member's perspective on like how you sort of assess that and the contributions to that. I think also like as a junior faculty member, there's a lot of good stuff in that like I can demonstrate that like the stuff that I use and create is used at other schools and like it's visited by people in general. But at the same time, I don't get to teach the same classes every single year. I'm sort of at the mercy of whatever the more senior faculty members in my department want to do. The co-authors that I wrote my graduate research methods textbook for, none of us taught after we published that book, none of us taught that course for the next year.
Oh, wow.
Because we are all adjunct or assistant professors in those departments. And so there's a lot of time and effort for a lot of uncertain professional rewards. And some of the, things that feel a little bit less safe are especially those more like critical and social justice oriented projects, where, I'm sort of arguing against part of the system the system that I'm a part of, which, those sort of roles can be fun.
I think that's a great definition of tension as a whole.
Yeah. Well, cool. So like I've talked for quite a bit. How do you sort of see some of these ideas, especially the ideas around digital literacy, impacting social work scholarship?
Yeah, I think what you said is so interesting, because I see that we're both, really talking about this time in social work practice and education that requires us to really think about how technology can disrupt our more static conventions about the creation and sharing of knowledge. And I think those are conversations we historically haven't had because the way we'd done it stuck around for so long. So I think what you're talking about, is such a great example of how we can model for our students the ways in which we can participate with knowledge from a social work lens in a digital society, and really start thinking about how we can use these technologies to transform and extend knowledge. And I think, it's not just a challenge for us as faculty, it's a challenge for our students too. And there's this assumption that because most of our traditional students are digital natives, they've grown up, completely immersed. My nephew called it the iPlad from the point he was about 2, was it time for iPlad and bedtime? This idea that because they've been exposed to it and they understand the nuts and bolts of using it, we overestimate that they understand what to do with it, or the implications of that learning, or the implications of that knowledge and data that's being generated. So when we start to think about that in the context of literacy, literacy historically is like a practice that's learned. It's not something we assume people know. So just like with little kids, they grow up surrounded by language. We don't assume that they're proficient in reading and writing, right? We have these very intentional ways of teaching them those skill sets and ways they can develop those over time. So I think as educators, it's really easy for us to start to equate this rampant technology use. I have my computer machine in my pocket all the time too, to answer kind of anything that comes up. But do they have this proficiency to understand the role that media is playing in their lives? I think in their learning and how it's driving their decision making. That question I'm not so sure of. It's not something that we've spent a tremendous amount of time talking about. So I think a really important aspect is there's such a big difference between using the internet or a digital tool and the implications of that use. So really looking to have more conversations and more attention to how we can fully participate in these digital spaces with our unique social work values and ethics and how we participate in a digital society.
Yeah, there's so much in that I really relate to, especially as a research methods instructor. I think one of the things that was always frustrating to me is that we sort of assume students know all of this digital literacy and that they're able to evaluate these sources, and we sort of skip past that, right, directly to teaching them about sampling, and we don't really get into is this a valid resource? How do you do that? Why should you not cite Psychology Today so much? So how does digital literacy relate to teaching and learning in social work?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to that idea of digital literacy is such a complex construct because our communication technologies are changing daily. So what is the hot platform or hot way to engage and disseminate information 6 months can be completely passé 6 months later. So I think, we really need to look at what are the skills that social workers need to really remain responsive and reflexive in digital environments. And so, as faculty, it really requires us to think differently about some of these conventions that are super germane to social work education and practice. So, I think we can all agree that tech and media are here to stay. User-generated content is just a part of our society and the way we move through life and do business. And I think we need to start being really intentional, like you talked about, in that how are we using it? What is that resource? What are we trying to do with it? So I think a really good example of that. So my teaching experience too is in research methods and also HBSE. So thinking in the context of person in the environment. So we're talking about, these foundational ideas around systems theory. And, can we make an argument to say that social media in all of its forms is a really large and important, not only social system, but also a social environment? So if we start to extend some of these things of like, what does a person and environment assessment look like? What are we paying attention to? Are we teaching our students how to see social media with both the affordances and constraints for, say, like family systems, for dynamics, for the realm of policy, for psychoeducation? Are we looking at the ways in which digital worlds can be strengths for systems and strengths for families and individuals? And are those strengths that we're missing out on capitalizing upon or finding ways to sort of look at those resiliencies? And I think with that, like, comes the flip side too of, overuse is something that can be a challenge too. So there can be these positive impacts on a system. So it can offer this resilience and these abilities to connect and extend knowledge, but it also can offer disconnection and challenges in relationship, being present, in health, in mental health. Finding that balance is a really important part. So I think really starting to think about, how do these concepts really change our approach to assessment and understanding, I think specifically like of human behavior in the social environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, some of the things that sort of stand out to me, I think, are just this sense of who I am inside of the digital space, and
Right.
that there's a lot of vulnerability in putting yourself out there in public. So like, I mean, there's just as a white dude, I don't get to experience a lot of the sexism that comes online, or a lot of the racism that comes online,
Right.
or a lot of the ableism, but like that stuff is
Yeah,
out there. And when students are
for sure.
attaching their name to those spaces and are participating in those spaces, there's definitely like building those resiliences, as you talked about, is really key.
Definitely.
Um, yeah, so what is a digital literacy challenge that you would like to share with faculty and encourage them to discuss with their students?
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes in two separate ways. I think one, if we really think about like how we define some of these like super concepts around digital literacy, we start to look at it as just equating it with knowledge and access of sort of like, we think in a broad sense of hardware devices and software applications. And if you click on this, what can you do within it? And I think this is a definition, right, that most social work students and faculty would agree on. Like, yep, we need to know how to use some of these pieces. And I think back of like, you're going to use a Word document, you're going to use a spreadsheet, you're probably going to use some sort of email communication system of some of, just the how do we operate in those spaces. But I think when we start to expand the definition to start to include like ability and an understanding to like critically analyze this digital content, critically analyze these applications, I think with both students and faculty, we start to find less proficiency. And if we really get to like the goals you were talking about with OER, of this idea that if our ultimate goal is to be able to create content and extend knowledge with digital technology, I think as a profession, we have some definite work to do around how we're looking at this. So I think social work has such a unique voice and lens to offer in the creation of this content, and in helping people understand and see the ways in which these digital technologies are impacting the lives of our clients and constituencies, how they're influencing policy and how they're creating public spaces. And I think this voice is so necessary. So really, if we kind of look at this idea of how is it defined in other places? And I think this is where the country and higher education in the United States is really behind some of our neighbors and partners in higher ed and how we're looking at these things too. So the European Commission on Education has this really awesome conceptualization of what digital literacy looks like. And they talk about it as it is integral across the lifespan. So like you start in pre-K, your colors and blocks, and we're starting to learn about some digital technologies and literacies. And this goes all the way into the professional sphere. So their definition, which I love, so they define it as the knowledge, skills, and attitudes, which includes abilities, strategies, values, and awareness that are required for ICT and digital media to be able to perform tasks, solve complex problems, communicate, manage information, collaborate, create and share content. And this is my favorite part of the whole definition: to build knowledge effectively, efficiently, appropriately, critically, creatively, autonomously, flexibly, and ethically, for reflective work, leisure, and participation in society, for socializing, consuming, and empowerment. And so like when I hear all those words, I'm like, one, like social work keyword bingo, like you would win the whole shebang with all those keywords. But really starting to think about, how do we, like you were talking about, like in the concept of research, right? We spend so much time talking to students about how to digest a journal article and what is generalizable and how far can you stretch that generalizability. And, if you change the client system or the age group, like does that start to change the outcome? But right, like we don't talk about this stuff in the tasks of this idea of, what is our aptitude and our intention and like reflection on how we're using these digital spaces. And so like the challenge that I would really give faculty with their students is, to really think about reevaluating and deepening our understanding of all of our favorite buzzword concept action of, hey, Google it, like, right? All the time. I think I've said this already today, like, Google it, what did you find? And, you know, when I hear that, like, I remember back to like about over a decade ago when I was teaching research methods where people were starting to get super used to just, you know, diving into the internet to find things. And they'd be like, what database did you use? And they'd be like, Google. I'm like, okay, Google's not a database, right? Google's a search engine. You know, let's talk about, you know, sort of this scholarly information. And I think 10 years ago, that distinction was getting easier to make. Like, this was a little before Google Scholar and before, I think, you know, some of the resources you're talking about, where there's really knowledgeable, credible resources creating this, you know, information for open consumption. And I think, like, with this too, with this idea, like, you know, students are really struggling with sitting and not knowing things. And I know, like, as a society, we're struggling with that. And that often that, like, that trumps our desire to fully understand what we're ingesting and how it is actually shaping our behaviors and our decisions. So there was a super great article last year in the Journal of Teaching and Higher Education by Bahat and McKenzie that talked about this concept of, they described it, which I loved, as epistemologies of ignorance. So this idea of, like, if you're building knowledge on something that was not actually knowledge per se, where do you end up? And, you know, so when you think about it too, in the context, like we were talking about, like with research methodology, right? You're digging into journals and there's a point at which, you know, we start to reach like that maximum saturation. You're seeing the same thing come up kind of over and over again. And you're like, no, I think I have a good sense of this concept, right? But we know there's been some screening in peer-reviewed journal articles, you know, that we can say there's some accuracy, there's something good here that we can say we probably have a pretty solid sense of this. That's not always the case in these digital spaces. And so students aren't aware of these sort of behind the scenes actors, like what are the algorithms telling them? How are these guiding their choices and how are they shaping their experiences? And so we start to get these ideas of like, well, some search engines are more reliable than others, like this search engine's neutral and just gives me the facts. So something that I did that was really helpful with my students in sort of talking about that and deconstructing that, and that was in the context of a research class where we were, you know, talking about, you know, the nature of knowing. How do we build knowledge? How do we know what we know? You know, how is knowledge constructed? And so I had everybody just like pull out your laptop and like pop up Google. And I said, you know, search vacations for me and let's start seeing what comes up. Everyone's like, oh, we're all going to get the same stuff. And as they start sharing of going through their search results of how specific it started getting to them in their socioeconomic status and their gender and the things they had done. And they're like, well, I would have assumed everybody would have got these same top 10 results. It's like, no, that's a well-constructed knowledge base on what it knows about you from where you've been, what you've done. So it's shaping and changing the lens of the information, you know, that we see, but also thinking about like, how is that going to show up in the lives of your clients? Like, you know, we're having hard conversations and in really messy, challenging things when we're out in the field. And often these are life-changing moments that people are going to Google. They're going to search it. They're going to see what they can find out. And so I think there's some of this ethical imperative of like, we need to understand how some of that information is created. But also we need to be able to walk through our clients and constituencies on, you know, where are some of the facts in this, or what is the lens that information is coming through? You know, so how do we really remain this idea that, you know, we're going to stay like critically reflexive in these conversations and think of how this information is ebbing and flowing? Because like, fact of the matter is, most students, once they graduate, do not have access to journals. This is not something they can just get. So it is going to be Google Scholar. It is going to be the Google search. It's going to be going to whatever website they think might be reputable. So how do we start to teach them sort of the skills, and how do we break this down? Like, how do we understand, like, how was this knowledge produced? Was it sponsored? How is it valued? Like, what's missing? Whose voice is it amplifying? To really think about those critical questions that I think we often would approach a more written text with. You know, we even think of like news stations and channels like, oh, they're owned by this company or they're owned by this person and it has this slant. But we don't think about that same slant and continuum and like who's producing knowledge on the internet and how are we consuming it. So I think my ultimate, you know, takeaway in it is this idea of really, you know, a call for social workers to promote and cultivate like a culture of awareness and the affordances and constraints of our media usage, what knowledge is out there, how it's created, and how we're ingesting it. that how that is really kind of behind the scenes driving some of our decision making and what we think is true, and really get to that place of that creativity and generativity where we can use our social work voice and lens, which I think the world needs more than ever. That is something we have seen consistently in the past couple of years, to really start pouring into these digital spaces and to promote and advocate for social good and individual and community well-being, that is ethical, that's person-centered, that's responsive, that honors social justice and like promotes autonomy, and, really seeing how we can fill spaces with these, aspects of social good and knowledge that is true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think it's helpful to sort of contextualize like this presentation, like under COVID, like we're normally be in person, we're normally supposed to do all those things. And I think one of the other things about that is that COVID has sort of reshaped how we think about media, because so much of it is created on the fly. And I mean, there are spurious studies, there are famous scientists who are advocating against lockdowns, like advocating against vaccines. And sort of it's this like rapidly evolving landscape. And I mean, just within COVID, we obviously need those skills in order to, create informed responses for ourselves and our clients and the systems that we work in. But, if we think about other social problems like that, and that those sort of same issues around how knowledge is generated and shared, all of those things are sort of endemic to how we deal with any social problem.
Exactly. I think that's so true. And I think, it's so interesting to see sort of where we are versus where we would have been a year ago, when we were planning on doing this presentation, of the way we've all been immersed in this, right? I mean, and it's been like a huge trial of how do we use these and what do we learn and how do we communicate and what do we figure out? But I think also this has set the stage for, I don't know that the world we came from exists post-COVID. I mean, I think hybrid interactions and how we're doing things digitally, I don't think it's going to look like this forever, but I think there are really positive lessons we've learned on creation and extension of knowledge and collaboration. I mean, in a huge ways of how we can use technology and how we can be present and build community and understanding. I think it's been a great challenge for academics to okay, how do we create and extend knowledge when you can't be around anybody, right? I mean, that kind of turned the institution on its head as it is, and students going, okay, I've got to figure out how to digest some of these things in these sometimes asynchronous complete settings where it is much more self-guided. But I think there's like really good skills and takeaways that we're learning in this that hopefully I think can help push us as social work educators kind of like more into that spot of being those knowledge creators in those spaces, because I think the world needs it.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's so much inside of what you're saying. I think, like COVID has caused us to sort of reconsider like what can be delivered asynchronously, what is virtual versus what is synchronous. And then at the same time, what about your course should be open? What should you be sharing? Like we've been creating a ton of digital resources for our classes and then putting them on a platform that pretty much no one will ever see and students will lose access to after the semester or after they graduate, which is silly. And so I think, it's just sort of reconsidering. It's not like everything is going to be open, everything is going to be online, but like we can no longer like those sort of choices are going to be made for us just by the situations that we're in.
Definitely. And I think, at the heart of all of it too, really is that social justice issue piece too. When you talked about the real college movement, I mean, that's something I've definitely seen, in the context of our university and our students of, making decisions between things like buying textbooks or buying access to digital platforms where they can take quizzes or watch videos or things like that, are like incredibly huge obstacles for some people. So I think the extent to which, we can make some of this information or utilize public spaces, open resources, to one, give our students tools that they can use once they leave the institution with whatever tools, learning platform, learning management system, journal access library that they have, that doesn't stay with us into professional practice. And as we know, like social workers in the institutions they work with aren't often rolling in funds to be able to purchase access to a lot of these things. So how can we extend that one, like education and learning across the lifespan, but really getting the important information, out of the institution and into the hands of people who need it and can use it later with their own clients and in their own, field supervision or when they're mentoring students. I think it's really important to start thinking about some of that transferability of how can this stuff live on outside of its one instance, one use, for maximum reach and maximum impact. So I think it was a really cool kind of thing to look at together of this sort of like open resources is kind of, I think, almost this epitome of like what digital literacy skills can look like. And if we're engaging in those spaces of how we can extend knowledge into like, how do we really start incorporating some of that with our teaching. And I think having just really some critical pauses and conversations around what are we doing with this knowledge? How is this knowledge made? Where do we want it to go? Where should it live? In ways that I think maybe, we just haven't entertained before.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are conversations that are happening. And, I think for maybe social workers who are a little bit less familiar with it, they feel like they may be encountering these ideas for the first time. But there are a ton of great pedagogues out there who are talking about this, like critical digital pedagogy, open pedagogy. These are, I mean, they're not like the oldest educational approaches, but they've been around for at least like a decade or so.
Yeah.
So you're going to be able to find a lot of the stuff, not just on like, and I think what really stands out to me from like the things you're saying are, it is about access. And I think, this is sort of what's different from the 2021 version of this, at least my version of it, versus the 2020 version of it, because the 2020 version was all about like access. Here's how to access journal articles, this is why you should put your stuff online. Here's OER comments, this is how to share your stuff. But it's about more than that. And I think what I really value about your scholarship is that it's about sort of the skills that are needed in order to critically engage with those platforms and to understand some of the invisible stuff behind them and how that stuff is created. So it's not just about, paywalls and how to get around them.
Granted, a part of the conversation, but not always the biggest part.
You need access in order to actually see the information, but you still need to be able to understand it and critically use it.
So true. So true. It goes hand in hand. It's an important relationship. So, Matt, thank you so much. Like, I think this is such a cool conversation, and I hope that, again, we'll post information on how folks can reach out to us if they have further questions or want to have conversations or engage in any of these things or learn more about what we're talking about. But I just love just the call to like, how as social work educators can we start to think about how we can disrupt systems in good ways and what systems have cracks that we need to explore more and need to look at. And I think just, post-COVID, critically really thinking about what are we doing and how and why are we doing it. So I hope this was like helpful and informative for folks. But again, thanks for hanging out and chatting with me today.
This has been a real treat. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you.
Bye.